A GoodKnight story. In October of 732 AD, on a wooded ridge between two rivers in the heart of Francia, a silver-armored knight stood shoulder to shoulder with 15,000 Frankish warriors as the finest cavalry of the Umayyad Caliphate thundered uphill toward their unmoving line. And in that frozen moment before impact, the entire future of Western Europe hung in the balance. Charles Martel, the hammer of the Franks, had positioned his heavy infantry on terrain that would turn the enemy's greatest strength into their fatal weakness, forcing the swift horsemen of Al-Andalus to charge uphill through dense forest into a wall of iron and discipline that would not break. This wasn't just another border skirmish. This was the collision of two worlds, the moment when the rapid expansion of the Umayyad Caliphate met the immovable will of the Frankish war machine, and our GoodKnight was there to witness every brutal second of it. From the 7 days of silent standoff in the October cold, to the desperate cavalry charges that shattered against Frankish shields like waves against stone, to the chaos when raiders struck the enemy camp and an entire army dissolved in panic, every moment of this epic clash would echo through the centuries. Subscribe to the GoodKnight stories for more immersive historical journeys that transport you to the turning points of civilization, where our eternal knight in silver armor walks beside you through the rise and fall of empires with storytelling designed for deep focus, relaxation, or peaceful sleep. Comment below which pivotal battle you'd like the GoodKnight to witness next. But for now, settle in, relax, and journey back to that cold October day in 732 when the fate of Europe was decided on a wooded hill in Francia. Chapter 1. The Road North. The GoodKnight had been riding for weeks. The roads of Aquitaine were choked with refugees. They moved in silent columns. Families with carts piled high with whatever they could carry, old men leading oxen, women clutching children who no longer cried because they had learned that crying brought no comfort. The autumn rains had turned the Roman roads to mud, and the mud was trampled by thousands of feet into a churned morass that sucked at hooves and wagon wheels alike. He passed through villages that were no longer villages. Blackened timbers stood where homes had been. The smell of old smoke hung in the air, mingling with the wet earth and the rot of unharvested grain left to moulder in the fields. The harvest had been abandoned. No one stayed to bring it in. The enemy was coming from the south, and everyone who could move was moving north. The GoodKnight's armor, always silver, always shining despite the road dust and the rain, marked him as a man of means, a warrior of some standing. People looked at him as he passed, their eyes hollow with exhaustion and fear, and he saw the question in their faces. Are you going to fight? Are you going to stop them? He did not answer. He simply rode. The horse beneath him was a sturdy Frankish destrier, broad-chested and patient, bred for carrying the weight of a fully armored man through long campaigns. The beast's breath steamed in the cool October air. The leaves were turning, gold and red and brown, and they fell in slow spirals from the oak and beech trees that lined the road. It should have been beautiful. It should have been the season of harvest festivals and Thanksgiving. Instead, it was the season of flight. The GoodKnight had heard the stories. Everyone had heard the stories. An army had come out of Al-Andalus, the land the Christians still called Hispania, though it had been Muslim for more than 20 years now. The army was led by a man named Abdul Rahman al-Ghafiqi, the governor of Cordoba, a commander who had restored order to the fractious tribes of the Caliphate and turned their restless energy northward. He had crossed the Pyrenees with tens of thousands of warriors, Arabs and Berbers, heavy cavalry and light skirmishers, men who had conquered from Damascus to the Atlantic and saw no reason to stop at the mountains. They had struck Aquitaine like a summer storm. Duke Odo, The ruler of this southern realm had met them at the river Garonne with his full strength. The battle had been a slaughter. The Mozarabic chroniclers would later write that God alone knows the number of the slain. Odo's army had been shattered. The Duke himself had fled north, abandoning his lands, his people, his pride, everything, to beg for help from the one man he had spent a lifetime resisting. Charles Martel, the mayor of the palace, the hammer. The GoodKnight was riding to join that man's army. He did not know if Charles would accept him. The Frankish warlord was notoriously selective about who fought in his shield wall. He wanted professionals, men who had trained together, who knew the rhythm of the phalanx, who would not break when the cavalry came. The GoodKnight was a stranger, a lone warrior with no lord's banner and no war band at his back. But he had his armor, his sword, and his experience. He had fought in more battles than he could count, in more lands than he could name. He had stood in shield walls before. He would stand in one again. The road climbed gently as he moved north, rising out of the river valleys of Aquitaine into the higher, drier country of central Francia. The refugees thinned. Here the war had not yet arrived. Farmers still worked their fields, though they glanced nervously southward as they did so. Village headmen stood at crossroads, arguing in tight clusters about whether to flee or fortify. Priests led prayers in small stone churches, their voices rising in Latin chants that had been sung for 300 years, ever since the Franks had converted under Clovis. The GoodKnight stopped at one such church to water his horse. The priest, an old man with a face like weathered oak, came out to greet him. "You're going north," the priest said. It was not a question. "I am." "To join Charles?" "Yes." The priest nodded slowly. "They say he's gathering the host near Tours. They say he's called every man who can hold a spear." He paused, studying the GoodKnight's armor. "They say the Saracens are coming for the Abbey of St. Martin. All that gold, all those relics, the tomb of the saint himself." The GoodKnight said nothing. "Will you stop them?" the priest asked. It was the same question the refugees had asked with their eyes. The GoodKnight met the old man's gaze. "I will stand where Charles Martel tells me to stand." The priest smiled faintly. "Then God go with you, warrior. And St. Martin as well." The GoodKnight rode on. Chapter 2. The Gathering. He reached the muster point 3 days later. The Frankish army was assembling on the north bank of the Loire, in the broad fields outside the town of Tours. The sight of it stopped the GoodKnight on the crest of a low hill. He had seen armies before, many armies, but this was something different. There were thousands of men. They were not the ragged levies of a desperate kingdom. They were not farmers pulled from their plows and handed spears. These were professionals. They moved with purpose. Their camps were organized in neat rows, each warband clustered around its lord's banner. Smoke rose from hundreds of cooking fires. The sound of hammers on anvils rang out as smiths repaired armor and sharpened blades. Horses were picketed in long lines, and supply wagons were being unloaded under the watchful eyes of quartermasters who checked every sack of grain and every barrel of salted pork. This was Charles Martel's war machine. The GoodKnight rode down into the camp. No one stopped him. Sentries watched him pass, but they did not challenge a man in full armor riding openly toward the center of the host. He followed the main avenue between the tents, heading toward the largest pavilion, a structure of heavy canvas dyed deep blue with the banner of the Pippinid house flying above it. Charles Martel was inside. The GoodKnight dismounted and handed his reins to a young squire who appeared at his elbow. He removed his helmet, always a sign of peaceful intent, and approached the entrance to the pavilion. 2 guards stood there, both in mail, both holding long spears. They crossed the spears to bar his way. "State your business," one said. "I've come to fight," the good knight replied. "Name?" He hesitated. He had been called many things over the years. He had served under many banners. But here, now, he had no name that would mean anything to these men. "I am a knight," he said simply. "I have armor and a sword. I know how to stand in a shield wall." The guard studied him for a long moment, then nodded to his companion. One of them ducked inside the pavilion. There was a murmur of voices. Then the guard returned and lifted the spear. "The mayor will see you." The good knight stepped inside. The interior of the pavilion was dim and cool. A long table dominated the center, covered with maps, crude drawings on vellum showing rivers, roads, and the positions of towns. Around the table stood a dozen men, all warriors, all wearing mail or leather. They looked up as the good knight entered, their eyes assessing him with the cold calculation of veterans. At the head of the table stood Charles Martel. He was not a tall man, but he radiated authority. His hair was iron grey, cut short in the Frankish style. His face was hard and weathered, lined with the scars of a lifetime of war. He wore a simple tunic of dark wool, belted at the waist, and over it a brunia, a coat of mail that hung to his knees. His hands, resting on the edge of the table, were broad and scarred. These were the hands of a man who had swung a sword in anger more times than most men drew breath. Charles looked at the good knight and said nothing for a long moment. Then he spoke, his voice low and rough, like stones grinding together. "You want to fight?" "Yes, my lord." "Why?" It was a simple question, but it carried weight. The good knight considered his answer carefully. "Because the enemy is coming. Because someone has to stand against them." Charles grunted. "Noble sentiment. But I don't need noble sentiment. I need men who can hold a line when 10,000 horsemen are trying to kill them." He stepped around the table, moving closer, his eyes never leaving the good knight's face. "Can you do that?" "I can. You fought cavalry before. Many times." "Where?" The good knight hesitated. The truth was complicated. He had fought in battles that these men would not believe, in lands they had never heard of, in wars that had not yet been written into the chronicles. But he could not say that. So he said, "In the east, against the Avars, against the Lombards." Charles nodded slowly. "The Avars are horsemen, good horsemen. If you've stood against them and lived, you know what's coming." He turned back to the table, gesturing at the maps. "The Saracens are 3 days south of here, maybe less. They've been moving slowly because they're dragging half of Aquitaine with them. Plunder, captives, everything they've looted from Bordeaux to Poitiers. Duke Odo says their baggage train stretches for miles." One of the other men, a grizzled warrior with a scar running from his temple to his jaw, spat on the ground. "Let them drag it. It'll slow them down, make them fat and lazy." "It'll also make them desperate," Charles said. "They won't abandon that loot without a fight. Which means when we meet them, they'll commit everything." He looked back at the good knight. "We're going to meet them on ground of my choosing. High ground, wooded, terrain that breaks up their charges. And we're going to stand there until they break, or we do." "When?" the good knight asked. "Soon. We march south tomorrow. We'll find a place between here and Poitiers, somewhere they have to come to us, Charles." Paused, then added, "If you're going to fight with us, you'll fight in the center. That's where the pressure will be heaviest. That's where men die if the line breaks. Can you hold?" The good knight met his gaze. "I can hold." Charles studied him for another long moment, then nodded. "Good. Report to Theodoric. He commands the center. Tell him I sent you." He turned back to the maps, dismissing the good knight with a gesture. The good knight bowed, a shallow, respectful nod, and left the pavilion. Outside, the camp was alive with activity. Men were sharpening weapons, checking armor, drilling in small groups. The good knight found Theoderic, a massive man with a black beard and arms like tree trunks, overseeing a group of warriors practicing the shield wall. Theoderic listened to the good knight's explanation, grunted, and pointed to a space in the line. "Stand there tomorrow. Don't break. Don't run. If the man next to you falls, step into his place. Understand?" "I understand." "Good. Get some rest. You'll need it." The good knight found a place to sleep near the edge of the camp. He unsaddled his horse, rubbed the animal down, and fed it from a sack of oats he'd been carrying. Then he sat with his back against a tree, his sword across his knees, and watched the sun set over the Loire. The sky turned gold, then red, then purple. The stars came out, cold and distant. Somewhere to the south, an army of horsemen was riding north, dragging the wealth of a conquered land behind them. And somewhere between here and there, on a piece of ground not yet chosen, the good knight would stand in a line of men and face them. He had done this before. He would do it again. He closed his eyes and let the sounds of the camp wash over him, the murmur of voices, the crackle of fires, the distant whinny of horses. Tomorrow they would march, and soon after that they would fight. He was ready. Chapter 3. The march south. They broke camp at dawn. The Frankish host moved like a great beast waking from sleep. Slow at first, then gathering momentum as the war bands fell into their marching columns. The good knight rode near the center, surrounded by Theoderic's men. They were a hard lot, these warriors. Most were in their 30s or 40s, veterans of Charles's endless campaigns against Frisians, Saxons, and rival Frankish lords. They wore their scars like badges of honor. They spoke little, and when they did, it was in the clipped, efficient language of men who had fought together for years. The good knight listened and learned. He learned that Theoderic had served Charles since the civil wars, when Charles had fought his own stepmother for control of Austrasia. He learned that many of these men had been granted land, small estates carved from church holdings that Charles had seized to fund his army. They were not quite knights in the later sense, but they were no longer mere warriors either. They were Antrustions, sworn men, bound to Charles by oaths of loyalty and the promise of continued reward. They were professionals, and they knew what was coming. The march south took 2 days. Charles set a steady pace, not hurried but relentless. He sent scouts ahead, light cavalry, men on fast horses who could ride hard and report back quickly. The scouts returned with news. The Umayyad army was moving north along the old Roman road from Poitiers. They had bypassed the city itself, leaving it untouched, and were heading straight for Tours. "They want the abbey," Theoderic said as they made camp on the first night. "St. Martin's tomb, all that gold, the church plate, the relics. It's the richest target in Francia." "Will Charles let them reach it?" the good knight asked. Theoderic shook his head. "He'll stop them before they get there. He's looking for the right ground, somewhere we can anchor our flanks, somewhere their horses can't maneuver." He spat into the fire. "Charles doesn't fight fair. He fights smart." On the second day, the scouts reported that the Umayyad army had slowed. They were encumbered by their baggage train, miles of carts and pack animals loaded with plunder. Charles smiled when he heard this. It was the first time the good knight had seen him smile, and it was not a pleasant expression. "They're fat with loot," Charles said to his commanders. "They'll fight to keep it, and that means they'll fight on our terms." By midday, the Frankish army reached the place Charles had chosen. It was a low ridge, heavily wooded, running east to west between two rivers, the Clain and the Vienne. The ridge was not steep, but it was high enough to force an attacker to charge uphill. The trees were dense, oak and beech, their branches interlocking overhead to create a canopy that filtered the sunlight into a dim green twilight. The ground was firm, not muddy, and covered with a thick carpet of fallen leaves. Charles rode along the ridge, studying it with the eye of a man who had fought on 100 battlefields. Then he turned to his commanders and pointed. "Here. We form the line here. Infantry in the center. Theoderic, you'll hold the middle. Odo's Aquitanians on the left flank. My household guard on the right. Archers behind the line. Not many, but enough to harass them as they come up the slope." "What about cavalry?" one of the commanders asked. Charles shook his head. "We don't have enough to matter. And even if we did, I wouldn't use them. Cavalry breaks, infantry holds. We're going to be a wall. Let them break themselves against us." The commanders dispersed to position their men. The GoodKnight followed Theoderic to the center of the ridge. The ground here was slightly higher than the flanks, a natural strong point. Theoderic paced it off, counting steps, then turned to his men. "This is where we stand. Shield wall, 3 ranks deep. Front rank kneels when they charge. Brace your spears in the ground, angle them up to catch the horses. Second rank stands and thrusts over the first. Third rank is reserve. Step forward when the man in front of you falls." He looked at each of them in turn. "We don't move. We don't retreat. We hold until they break, or we die. Understood?" The men nodded. There were no questions. They had done this before. The GoodKnight found his place in the second rank. The man to his left was a grizzled veteran named Gunther, who had a scar across his nose and was missing 2 fingers on his left hand. The man to his right was younger, perhaps 25, with a thick blonde beard and nervous eyes. His name was Wulfric. "First time?" Gunther asked Wulfric. "Against cavalry, yes," Wulfric admitted. Gunther grunted. "Don't look at the horses, look at the riders. The horses don't want to run into a wall of spears. The riders will try to force them. Your job is to make sure the horse wins that argument." He tapped his spear. "Aim for the chest. If you hit the rider, fine. If you hit the horse, even better. A falling horse takes down 3 men." Wulfric nodded, swallowing hard. The GoodKnight said nothing. He checked his equipment methodically. His shield was solid, linden wood, faced with leather, with an iron boss in the center. His spear was ash, 8 feet long, with a leaf-shaped blade. His sword, his spatha, hung at his side, ready to draw if the line collapsed into close combat. His armor, the silver brunia, was buckled tight. He could feel its weight, familiar and reassuring. They waited. The Frankish army settled into position along the ridge. 15,000 men, perhaps more, spread out in a line nearly a mile long. The trees concealed their numbers. From below, it would be impossible to tell how many warriors stood on the ridge. That was part of Charles's plan. Let the enemy guess. Let them wonder. The sun climbed toward noon. The air was cool, the sky clear. October in Francia. The leaves rustled in a light breeze. Somewhere in the forest a bird sang. And then, from the south, came the sound of drums. Chapter 4. The 7 days the Umayyad army arrived that afternoon. The GoodKnight saw them from the ridge, a dark mass moving along the Roman road, spreading out as they approached the Frankish position. There were thousands of them. The sunlight glinted off spear points and helmets. Banners fluttered in the breeze, green and white, the colors of the caliphate. The sound of their drums rolled across the fields like distant thunder. They did not attack. Instead, they made camp. The GoodKnight watched as the Umayyad warriors dismounted and began setting up their tents in the fields below the ridge. It was an organized process, almost leisurely. The baggage train arrived, an enormous column of carts and pack animals that stretched back along the road as far as the eye could see. The warriors unloaded their plunder, stacking it in guarded piles. Fires were lit, horses were picketed, sentries were posted. Charles Martel watched from the ridge and smiled again. "They're not ready," he said to Theoderic. "They're tired. They've been marching for weeks, and they don't want to leave all that loot unguarded." "Will they attack tomorrow?" Theoderic asked. "Maybe. Maybe not. It doesn't matter. We're not going anywhere." And so began the waiting. For 7 days, the two armies faced each other across the fields. The Umayyads did not attack. The Franks did not advance. It was a standoff, a test of wills and logistics. The GoodKnight stood in the line each day, watching the enemy camp. He could see the Umayyad warriors moving about, some tending to their horses, others sharpening weapons or practicing with their bows. They were confident, these men. They had conquered an empire. They had swept across North Africa and Spain, crushing every army that stood against them. They had no reason to fear a bunch of Frankish infantry standing on a wooded hill. But as the days passed, the GoodKnight began to notice changes. The nights were getting colder. October was sliding into November. The Franks, dressed in heavy wool cloaks and furs, were comfortable. But the Umayyad warriors, accustomed to the warmth of Andalusia and North Africa, were not. The GoodKnight could see them huddling around their fires at night, wrapped in thin cloaks that were not meant for the northern cold. Supplies were another problem. The Franks were camped near Tours, with access to the town's granaries and the support of the local population. Food and water were plentiful, but the Umayyads were foraging in hostile territory. Their supply lines stretched all the way back to the Pyrenees. Every day, parties of horsemen rode out to scour the countryside for food, and every day they returned with less. And every day, more Frankish warriors arrived. Charles had sent word across Francia, calling in every favour, every oath, every promise of land and plunder. Men came from Austrasia and Neustria, from Burgundy and Provence. They were not all professionals. Some were levies, farmers with spears, but they swelled the Frankish numbers. By the 5th day, the ridge was crowded with warriors. By the 7th day, the Frankish line stretched even farther, overlapping the Umayyad flanks. Abdul Rahman, the Umayyad commander, could see what was happening. He was running out of time. Winter was coming. His men were cold and hungry. His supply lines were stretched to the breaking point, and the Frankish army was growing stronger every day. On the 7th day, he made his decision. The GoodKnight saw the change in the enemy camp that morning. The Umayyads were forming up, not in the loose, scattered groups of the previous days, but in tight, disciplined ranks. The cavalry were mounting. The banners were being raised. The drums were beating a new rhythm, faster and more urgent. Theoderic saw it too. He turned to his men and shouted, "They're coming! Form the wall!" The Frankish line came alive. Warriors grabbed their shields and spears and moved into position. The front rank knelt, bracing their spears in the ground. The second rank stood close behind, spears leveled. The third rank waited, swords drawn, ready to step forward. The GoodKnight took his place in the second rank. His heart was beating faster now, but his hands were steady. He had done this before. He knew what was coming. Across the field, the Umayyad cavalry began to move. Chapter 5. The Charge. They came in waves. The first wave was the light cavalry, Berber horsemen on swift, agile mounts. They rode forward at a trot, then a canter, then a full gallop. They carried javelins and short spears, and as they closed the distance, they hurled them at the Frankish line. The javelins arced through the air, glinting in the sunlight. Most fell short, thudding into the ground in front of the ridge. A few reached the line. The GoodKnight heard the thunk of a javelin striking a shield, the grunt of a man taking the impact. But the line held. The shields overlapped, forming a continuous barrier. The javelins could not penetrate. The Berber horsemen wheeled away before they reached the line, unwilling to charge into the wall of spears. They circled back, regrouped, and charged again. Again, they hurled their javelins. Again, the line held. This was Kar Wafar, attack and withdraw. It was a tactic designed to harass and demoralize, to wear down the enemy's resolve before the heavy cavalry delivered the killing blow. But the Franks did not break. They stood like stones, their shields locked, their spears steady. After the third charge, the Berber horsemen pulled back. The GoodKnight could see frustration in their movements. They had expected the Franks to panic, to scatter, to run, but the line had not moved. And then the heavy cavalry came. The Arab elite, the core of Abdul Rahman's army, rode forward in a solid mass. These were not light skirmishers. These were warriors in mail, riding powerful war horses, carrying long lance and straight swords. They moved with the confidence of men who had broken every enemy they had ever faced. The drums beat faster. The banners streamed in the wind. The thunder of hooves shook the ground. The GoodKnight tightened his grip on his spear. Beside him, Wulfric was breathing hard, his knuckles white on his shield. Gunther, on the other side, was calm, his eyes fixed on the approaching cavalry. "Steady!" Theodoric shouted from somewhere behind them. "Hold the line! Let them come to us!" The cavalry charged up the slope. The trees broke their formation. The riders had to weave between the trunks, losing cohesion, losing speed, but they came on, driving their horses forward with spurs and shouts. 50 yards. 40. 30. The front rank of the Frankish line braced their spears, angling them upward. The second rank, the GoodKnight's rank, leveled their spears over the shoulders of the men in front. 20 yards. 10. And then the cavalry hit the line. The impact was like a thunderclap. Horses screamed. Men shouted. The sound of metal on metal rang out. Spears striking mail, swords clanging against shields. The GoodKnight felt the shock of it through his whole body as the line absorbed the charge. A horse reared in front of him, its rider struggling to control it. The GoodKnight thrust his spear forward, aiming for the rider's chest. The blade struck mail and skidded off, but the force of the blow knocked the rider sideways. The horse, panicked, turned and bolted back down the slope. Another rider came at him, lance lowered. The GoodKnight raised his shield, and the lance struck it with a force that nearly knocked him off his feet. But the shield held. The rider swept past, and Gunther's spear caught him in the side, punching through mail and into flesh. The rider toppled from his horse and disappeared into the press of bodies. The line was holding. The Frankish warriors fought with a cold, methodical efficiency. They did not chase the enemy. They did not break formation. They simply stood and killed anything that came within reach of their spears. The horses, terrified by the wall of steel and the smell of blood, refused to press forward. The riders, unable to break through, wheeled away and regrouped. The first charge had failed, but the Umayyads did not give up. They charged again, and again, and again. Each time, the pattern was the same. The cavalry would thunder up the slope, strike the line, and recoil. Each time, men died, Franks and Umayyads alike. The ground in front of the line became littered with bodies, horses and men tangled together in death. The grass was slick with blood. The GoodKnight lost track of time. The battle became a blur of motion and noise. The crash of shields, the screams of horses, the grunts of men fighting for their lives. His arms ached from thrusting his spear. His shield was battered and splintered. Sweat ran down his face, stinging his eyes. Beside him, Wulfric took a sword blow to the shoulder. The blade cut through his mail and into the muscle beneath. Wulfric cried out and staggered back. The man from the third rank stepped forward to take his place, and Wulfric was dragged to the rear, bleeding but alive. The line held. Chapter 6. The Turning Point. It was late afternoon when the battle shifted. The Umayyad cavalry had been charging for hours, and they were exhausted. The horses were lathered and blowing, their strength spent. The riders were frustrated and angry. They had thrown everything at the Frankish line, and the line had not broken. Abdul Rahman, watching from the rear, knew he was running out of time. The sun was sinking toward the horizon. If he did not break the Franks before nightfall, he would have to withdraw and try again tomorrow. And tomorrow, the Franks would be even stronger. He ordered one final all-out assault. Every available rider was committed. The entire Umayyad cavalry, thousands of horsemen, formed up for a massive charge. The GoodKnight saw them coming. It was like watching a storm roll across the plains, a dark, roiling mass of men and horses moving with terrible purpose. The drums beat a frantic rhythm. The banners streamed. The ground shook. Theodoric's voice rang out, hoarse but steady. "This is it! Hold the line! Hold!" The cavalry charged. And then from the rear of the Umayyad camp came a new sound, shouts of alarm, the clash of weapons, the screams of men caught by surprise. The Frankish scouts, or perhaps Duke Odo's Aquitanian cavalry, had circled around through the forest and struck the Umayyad baggage train. The effect was instantaneous. The Umayyad warriors, hearing the commotion, turned to look back. They saw their camp under attack. They saw their plunder, the gold, the captives, the spoils of 100 raids being looted by the enemy. Panic spread through the ranks like wildfire. For the tribal warriors of the Caliphate, the plunder was everything. It was their pay, their proof of valor, their future. Losing it was unthinkable. Without orders, without coordination, entire units of cavalry broke off from the charge and galloped back toward the camp to defend their loot. The charge disintegrated. The GoodKnight watched in disbelief as the Umayyad cavalry, which moments before had been a unified, unstoppable force, dissolved into chaos. Some riders continued the charge, crashing into the Frankish line with desperate fury. Others wheeled around and raced back toward the camp. Still others milled about in confusion, unsure what to do. Abdul Rahman saw his army falling apart. He rode forward, shouting orders, trying to rally his men. But in the chaos, his voice was lost. He spurred his horse toward the front, trying to restore order by his presence alone. It was a fatal mistake. The Frankish infantry, seeing the enemy commander exposed, surged forward. Theodoric's voice roared above the din. "The Emir! Kill the Emir!" A knot of Frankish warriors broke from the line and charged toward Abdul Rahman. The GoodKnight was among them. He dropped his broken spear and drew his sword, the long spatha, its blade gleaming silver in the fading light. Abdul Rahman's bodyguards tried to protect him, but they were overwhelmed. The Frankish warriors swarmed around the Emir, hacking at his horse, dragging him from the saddle. The GoodKnight saw the Emir fall, saw the spears rise and fall, saw the blood. Abdul Rahman al-Ghafiqi, the governor of Cordoba, the man who had led the Umayyad army to the gates of Tours, died in the mud of a Frankish battlefield, pierced by a dozen spears. With their commander dead and their camp under attack, the Umayyad army broke. The retreat was not orderly. It was a rout. The cavalry fled down the slope, abandoning the field, abandoning their wounded, abandoning everything in their desperation to escape. The Frankish warriors, exhausted and bloodied, watched them go. Charles Martel, standing on the ridge, raised his hand. "Hold the line! Do not pursue!" His commanders echoed the order. The Frankish warriors, though tempted to chase the fleeing enemy, obeyed. They had been trained to obey. They held their positions. The sun set. The battlefield fell silent, save for the moans of the wounded and the distant sound of the Umayyad army retreating into the gathering darkness. The GoodKnight stood in the line, his sword still in his hand, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Around him, men were collapsing to the ground, too exhausted to stand. Wulfric was being tended by a healer, his shoulder bandaged. Gunther was sitting on a fallen log, cleaning blood from his spear. Theodoric walked along the line, checking his men. When he reached the GoodKnight, he stopped and nodded. "You held," he said simply. "We all held," the GoodKnight replied. Theodoric smiled faintly. "Yes, we did." Chapter 7. The silent morning, the Franks slept in their formations that night. No one believed the battle was over. The Umayyad camp was still there, the tents still standing, the fires still burning. Charles Martel ordered his men to remain in position, weapons at hand, ready to fight again at dawn. The GoodKnight lay on the cold ground, his cloak wrapped around him, his sword across his chest. He did not sleep. He stared up at the stars, listening to the sounds of the night, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of an owl, the soft murmur of men talking in low voices. He thought about the battle. He thought about the men who had died, Franks and Umayyads alike. He thought about Abdul Rahman, the emir who had come so close to victory, only to die in the chaos of his own army's collapse. War was like that. It turned on moments. A raid on a baggage train, a commander's death, a line that held when it should have broken. The GoodKnight had seen it 100 times. He would see it 100 times more. When the sun rose, the Frankish warriors stood and formed their line again, ready for the next assault. But the assault did not come. Charles sent scouts forward to investigate. They returned with astonishing news. The Umayyad camp was empty. The tents were still standing, but there was no one inside. The fires had burned down to ash. The enemy had fled in the night, abandoning their tents, their wounded, and much of their plunder to speed their escape. The Umayyad army was gone. Charles Martel walked through the abandoned camp, his commanders at his side. The GoodKnight followed, along with Theodoric and the other warriors of the center. They moved cautiously, weapons ready, expecting an ambush. But there was no ambush. The camp was truly deserted. They found the plunder, piles of gold and silver, church plate, relics, sacks of coins. They found the wounded left behind to die. They found the bodies of the men who had fallen in the battle, already being picked over by crows. Charles stood in the center of the camp and looked south, toward the road the Umayyads had taken in their flight. "They won't come back," he said quietly. "Not this year. Maybe not ever." Theodoric grunted. "We broke them. We held." Charles corrected. And that was enough. The Frankish army remained on the ridge for another day, resting and tending to the wounded. Then Charles gave the order to march back to Tours. The battle was over. The threat was ended. The GoodKnight rode north with the army, his silver armor dented and scarred, but still shining in the autumn sun. He had stood in the line. He had held. He had survived. As they passed through the gates of Tours, the people came out to cheer. They threw flowers and shouted praises to Charles Martel, the hammer, the savior of Francia. Charles accepted their adulation with a nod. but he did not smile. He knew the truth. The battle had been won not by one man, but by thousands, by every warrior who had stood in that line and refused to break. The GoodKnight did not stay for the celebrations. He collected his horse, checked his equipment, and rode out of Tours, heading north. There would be other battles. There always were. And he would be there, standing in the line, holding the wall, because that was what he did. That was what he had always done. He was the GoodKnight, and he would return. Epilogue. The Echo of Tours. The Battle of Tours was over, but its echoes would reverberate through the centuries. Charles Martel's victory cemented his power in Francia. Within a few years, his son Pepin would depose the last Merovingian king and establish the Carolingian dynasty. Pepin's son, Charles, later called Charlemagne, would build an empire that stretched from the Atlantic to the Danube, and he would be crowned Emperor of the Romans by the Pope himself. The Umayyad Caliphate would never again threaten Francia. The Pyrenees became a hard border, a line that would define the geopolitical shape of Europe for 1,000 years. The rapid expansion of Islam into Western Europe was checked, not by divine intervention, but by the discipline and determination of Frankish heavy infantry standing on a wooded ridge in October. For the individual warriors who fought at Tours, the Antrustions and Vassi, the men who stood in the shield wall, the battle was a moment of validation. They had proven that infantry, properly trained and equipped, could defeat the finest cavalry in the world. They had proven that discipline and cohesion were more valuable than individual heroism. They had proven that a wall of iron, held by men of iron will, could not be broken. The GoodKnight rode away from Tours, but the memory of the battle stayed with him. He had stood with 15,000 men and faced an army that had conquered half the known world. He had felt the shock of the cavalry charge, the weight of the shield wall, the cold certainty that survival depended on the man next to him holding his ground. He had held. They had all held. And in holding, they had changed the world. The road stretched out before him, winding through the forests of Francia, leading to new lands, new battles, new stories. The leaves were falling, carpeting the road in gold and red. Winter was coming, but spring would follow, and with spring would come war. The GoodKnight rode on, his silver armor gleaming in the fading light, a lone figure on an endless road through time. He had stood at Tours. He had witnessed the moment when the fate of Europe was decided by the courage of ordinary men doing an extraordinary thing, standing firm when every instinct screamed to run. He would carry that memory with him through all the battles to come, through all the centuries that lay ahead, because he was the GoodKnight, and his journey was far from over.